James Swanson is the Edgar Award-winning author of the New York Times bestseller Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer, and an executive producer of the 2024 Apple TV series based on the book. It stars Tobias Menzies, Anthony Boyle, Hamish Linklater, Lil Taylor, and Patton Oswalt. Streaming now on Apple, the series has received rave reviews nationwide. Patricia Cornwell named Manhunt, along with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, as one of the two best nonfiction crime books ever written. James' book, Bloody Crimes, The Funeral for Abraham Lincoln and the Chase for Jefferson Davis, is the New York Times best-selling sequel to Manhunt. Chasing Lincoln's Killer is the best-selling adaptation of Manhunt for young adults, and Chasing King's Killer, The Hunt for Martin Luther King Jr.'s Assassin, was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. James has held several think tank and government posts in Washington, D.C., including at the U.S. Department of Justice and National Endowment for the Humanities. He is a Senate appointee to the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, created by Congress to plan the celebration in 2026 for the 250th anniversary of the United States. Please welcome Mr. James Swanson.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I have a quick question because I don't have it in front of me. I didn't want to miss a presentation later by Wade Hudson. Can somebody look at your calendar and tell me what time he's speaking? He's a young adult author. I'd appreciate knowing that. Anyway, so someone just shout it out when you see it. Well, it's great. Pardon? Where? In which tent? All right, thank you. Okay, it's great to be back at this festival. I think this is my fourth appearance at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. And Judd was kind enough to invite me early on in my career. So I live in D.C., and I'm always thrilled to come to this festival. It's just great. And I love that it's still got outdoor tents. At D.C., we gave up the tents at the National Book Festival, but being outside, even if it's in the rain, I think adds to the spirit of the festival, which I really enjoy. I'll talk a little bit about how I got into this before I get to the book. I grew up in a family of storytellers. My grandmother worked for the old Chicago newspapers at the tail end of what I call the front page Ben Hecht era. She worked for the Sun Times, the Daily News, and she grew up with wild stories as a girl, and then she taught me wild stories as a boy. One of my favorites was when I was 6 years old. I was only 6. She said, "Jamie, did you know that during the World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago, where I was born, a madman doctor murdered 100 girls and then dissolved their bodies in acid?" And my mother said, "He's 6. No, he did not know that until you told him." Then one time my grandfather, who was a Chicago policeman from the 1930s, the Al Capone era, to the late 1960s, the Vietnam War protests and civil rights protest era, came home one day and said to my mother, "Don't let Jamie read the newspapers." What did I do that night? What was the headline in the Sun-Times? "Madman slaughters 9 student nurses in their apartment." Does anyone remember Richard Speck, that name? And the only reason they caught him is he captured so many of the women, he forgot that one of them escaped and hid under a bed. And she saw the tattoo on his arm that said, "Born to Raise Hell." And that was noticed at the hospital, and that led to his capture and to his incarceration. My father went to Lane Tech High School in Chicago. When he was a kid, the teachers used to point to a desk and say, "At that desk sat Herbert Hans Haupt, one of the 8 Nazi saboteurs landed by U-boat on American shores." When I was at Department of Justice, at Office of Legal Counsel, which is advisor on the Constitution to the President and to the Attorney General, there was a bronze plaque across the hall from my door that said, "In this door, by military tribunal, were tried the 8 Nazi saboteurs," and named them. One of them was the guy who went to my father's high school. Born in Germany, moved to Chicago, went to school in Chicago, went back to Germany. The war broke out, and he became a Nazi agent. And he was one of the 8 who was imprisoned in the basement of Department of Justice. It used to be our tech center. There was a prison cell down there, and he was one of the 8 Nazis who were electrocuted for espionage during World War II. And then Anybody here from Chicago who's lived in Chicago? There was on Belmont Avenue, Ann Sather's Swedish restaurant. Do you remember that? The 900 block of Belmont Avenue. Near it was a gift shop called Toguri, Toguri, and Sons Gifts. And my father said, I want you to go in that shop. I want you to pick something to buy. Here's a couple bucks. Buy it from that woman behind the counter. So I picked a little porcelain figure of a lion and bought it from her and talked to her. We went outside, and my father said, you've just met Tokyo Rose, the woman who did radio broadcasts against American soldiers from Japan during World War II. She was actually one of 5 or 6 Tokyo Roses. It was several women all impersonating Tokyo Rose. And so I grew up with these wild tales, and that's just the tip of the things I was told. When my agent said, what do you want to do next? I said, well, I know this great story of a madman who dissolved 100 girls in acid. And then he said, well, do you know who Eric Larson is? I said, yeah. He said, I happen to know Eric, and I know he's in the middle of writing that book. So I thought, damn it, Eric Larson stole the book I was meant to write. My agent said, well, what else have you got? I said, well, there was a 12-day manhunt for John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated Abraham Lincoln in the climax of the Civil War. And he said, I think I could sell that. And that led to my manhunt book because Eric stole my Devil in the White City idea without knowing that I was interested in it. And this Deerfield book really began when I was in college, when I received a historic Deerfield fellowship in early American history. One of the outfits in Deerfield, well, there are 2 outfits in town. One is the PVMA, or the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, which has the old Indian door, which I'll explain in a moment. And then there's Historic Deerfield, which owns about 15 of the museum houses on the street and is a main museum. And every summer they invite 6 to 8 college students to spend the summer in Deerfield, studying early American art, architecture, silver, ceramics, textiles, the gamut. And I did that one summer and became entranced with the story of the Deerfield Massacre. I lived in a house that summer from before the American Revolution, just down the street from where the whole attack happened, and not far from the burial ground, where some of the key graves are situated now that I'll mention. So the Deerfield story has really been a long passion project of mine. I've been to Deerfield probably 100 times since I had this fellowship, and so it's something I've always wanted to write about and been very interested in. I'm going to read one quotation. I don't read from the book because I get bored when authors read from their books, and I think, well, I could read that myself. I just want to read a brief paragraph about Deerfield. This is by Conrad Aiken from 1937, published in the WPA Guide to Massachusetts. It is no exaggeration to say that Deerfield is not so much a town as the ghost of a town. The most beautiful ghost of its kind, and with the deepest poetic and historic significance to be found anywhere in America. The Deerfield Massacre is really a forgotten tale of war and death, empire and competition, battle and blood, endurance and survival, family and faith, resurrection and redemption from a long-lost early America that we don't recognize or remember. This was 75 years before the American Revolution, long before George Washington, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and all the rest of the founders had even been born. It was really one of the most frightening times in American history. At the center of the story is Reverend John Williams, who was the pastor in Deerfield from 1686 until 1729. And I think nobody here has ever heard Reverend John Williams. But he's one of the great early American heroes, one of the great religious leaders in American history who lived a life of exemplary honor and who kept his congregation alive after the attack, wrote about it in an early best-selling book in New England history, and one of the preeminent figures in the story of religious freedom and faith and independence in early America. So one reason I did the book was really as a tribute to Reverend John Williams. It happened in February 1704. I'm going to take my iPhone out. I'm not going to do emails while I'm talking. I just want to make sure I don't talk too long. So I'm going to set the phone in front of me now. Okay. Well, it happened in February 1704. And it was a time of superstition and fear. fear of the dark forest, the primeval forest, Indian tribes. It was an era of witches and devils. Not long before Deerfield, in Salem, Massachusetts, 20 people were executed, hanged, or in the case of Giles Corey, crushed to death with a board and heavy rocks piled on to make him confess. People believed in witchcraft. It was real. It was not imagined. During the Salem trials, not one person said, well, this is fake. It's superstition. Nobody believes in witches. Nobody defended themselves that way. They said they weren't a witch. Strangely, many people who confessed were spared. Those who denied they were witches were often hanged. And imagine how terrifying it is. Deodette Lawson was one of the ministers involved in this. Imagine being in the congregation where everyone shares the same belief. There is witchcraft, and if you're a witch, you'll have to die. He waves his hand over the congregation and says, pointing to people, and says, Christ knows how many devils there are. And imagine if he pauses and points to you. Spectral evidence was accepted as true. Spectral evidence would be, as some of the teenage girls did in town, well, I duly saw her flying at night, and she carried her pouch over her shoulder, and she said that's where she carried her victuals, her food. That was considered authentic evidence. And some people were put to death because these girls said, she came to me at night and she pricked me with pins, and the pain was so great. That would be enough to hang you. So that was the atmosphere in early New England, in Deerfield, at the end of the 1600s and the early 1700s. And Deerfield was an isolated little village of 300 people. It had survived barely King Philip's War of 1675. The most famous episode then was the so-called Bloody Brook Massacre, when a number of men from Deerfield were transporting grain to soldiers during King Philip's War, the great conflict at that time, and they were surprised at a little brick crossing. They stopped to observe a canopy of grapes hanging above their heads. They laid down their muskets. There are only about 70 of them. They laid down their muskets and started to eat the grapes. One of the Mather brothers, the religious leaders of early Massachusetts, said, dear and deadly grapes, they proved to them, because 800 to 1,000 natives emerged from the brush and attacked these less than 100 men. It was a massacre. The Bloody Brook Massacre monument is still there. And ever since that time, for a quarter century, since 1675 to the early 1700s, the forest would express itself through a child disappears and no one sees the child again. A man goes to plow his crops. He vanishes and he's never seen. A family goes to tend the fields, and all the women are tomahawked, are scalped, and no Indians can be found. So it was a time of superstition and fear throughout New England. There was no army in Deerfield. They had their own muskets, and they were really on their own. The British theory of empire was the colonists had to take care of themselves. And in many towns, you'd never see a redcoat or a British soldier. You're on your own to protect yourself. And so, on the night of February 29th, 1704, leap year, a party of French and Indians, approximately 300, various tribes. And let me interrupt by saying, when I use the word Indians, that's the preferred term used by the Museum of the American Indian. It's preferred by many Indian friends of mine, including the Chickasaw ambassador to the United States and others. And I'm told by the museum and by all my Indian friend leaders, they prefer if we use tribal names. And so in Canada, it was the Abnakis, Hurons, Mohawks, Iroquois, the mountain, and Pennacox. Came down with the French, about 250 Indians, about 50 French leaders. They marched 300 miles through snow and ice, on foot, dog sleds, to Deerfield. Deerfield was the closest New England town, stranded in northwest Massachusetts, and most vulnerable to attack. Canada was closer than Boston. And they went on this march, and Deerfield knew there was danger. They'd received reports of keep a lookout. But then winter came, and they let down their guard. And one day the French and Indians arrived. There was a huge snowdrift, 10 feet high against the palisade surrounding the fort. The Indians had snowshoes. They scaled that snowdrift, and they dropped into the fort. They had one guard. They weren't keeping careful watch. The first warning of the attack was the attack itself. Musket fire, torches. They set almost every house in the town on fire and began breaking down the doors, breaking through windows. One of the first people who suffered this was Reverend Williams. He was awakened when Mohawks burst through his front door. He fired a pistol at one of them at the chest. It misfired. They captured him. His family was forced to dress quickly and hustled outdoors. That's when he suffered his first tragedy. He had his two youngest children, a newborn child, 6 weeks old, and a young child, infant child, were immediately slaughtered at the front door by Mohawks, swung through the air and had their heads smashed on the headstone, killed. Then attacked was Reverend Williams' slave, Parthena, a woman who was married to a man named Frank, who was captured that day. So the first thing was to kill the two children of Reverend Williams, kill their nursemaid, and then kill up to 50 other people in town, burning the houses. Houses would collapse, people would be smothered to death, killed by war clubs. The favorite Indian weapon of the time was the war club, not the tomahawk. It could inflict a tremendous blow, heavily weighted at the end, and it was like being hit by a baseball bat wielded by Babe Ruth. That's the power of the war club. And so 50 people were killed. 112 people were taken captive in the middle of the night. The raid happened about 3 in the morning. It was dark. The objective was not to kill everyone. The objective was to take as many captives as possible. Multiple motives. One, some of the tribes practiced what they called mourning wards, mourning. They wanted to replace Indians who died from battle or from illness or disease and adopt people into their tribes, especially young boys and young girls. They didn't want to torture them, keep them as slaves. They wanted to make them into Indians. Those children ultimately would forget to speak English, would speak native, they would forget their faith and become true Indians. And later, many of them married into the tribes and lived in Canada with them for the rest of their lives. The other motive of some of the tribes was vengeance and revenge for dispossession of Indian lands. Another motive was to ransom captives and sell them to French leaders who would want to buy them and then ransom them back to the English in exchange for fair deals with English captives. And so there were multiple motives, and it depended on which tribe captured you and what their motive in taking you was. These people were taken on a 300-mile forced march to Canada through snow and ice in the middle of February winter. Of the 112 who were marched to Canada, 20 were slain along the way. Anyone who couldn't keep up, a toddler, an adolescent, a pregnant woman who had just given birth, they were slain by tomahawks or war clubs without mercy. In defense, and my book, by the way, also incorporates very much the Indian and Native point of view, who they were. This is not a cowboys and Indians book where the Indians are the bad guys, the white settlers are the good guys. But the culture of the tribes, not only practiced by them against each other in their warfare against other Indian tribes, was vicious and merciless. Anyone who couldn't keep up was killed. One woman I think of with sadness is a woman named Mary Brooks. She approached Reverend Williams and said, I've just fallen on the ice. I'm pregnant. I've just miscarried my baby. The baby's dead inside me. I can't walk. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me today. Pray with me. And that's what happened. Reverend Williams prayed with her, and she was killed that day. And that happened to 20 people along the way. The second night, they murdered Frank, Parthena's husband. Some of the tribes hated black people, and they didn't like Parthena and Frank because they were black, of African origin. So they were both slaughtered. Over 80 of the captives made it to Canada. And then they were held by the French and by various tribes and tribal encampments. They weren't kept in one prison. They had different experiences. One of Reverend Williams' sons was raised as an Indian, but didn't accept that way, and then he was ransomed with his father to come back to England. The French Jesuits had a mission. They wanted to convert as many captives as possible to surrender the Puritan faith and become Catholic. So they first offered Reverend Williams bribes, money, cash, better clothing. They offered to release him and his entire family from captivity if Williams would renounce the Protestant faith and accept Catholicism. And Reverend Williams said, I'd rather die than give up the faith. Just kill me now. They didn't, because they knew he was such an important figure. He never recanted, and so he was one of the last to come home. Williams and about 70 captives came back to Deerfield. As I said, some of them never came back. Williams went back to the town. One might think the last place he'd want to go is to go back to Deerfield. His son, Stephen, who was released, didn't want to go. He said, it was a melancholy place for me. The town was still subject to attack. For the next decades, Deerfield was subject to Indian raids. But he was brave and stalwart and didn't want to give up his town or his congregation. So he moved back to Deerfield. They built him another house, and he inspired the congregation for another quarter century until his death decades later. One thing he always hoped was that his little girl Eunice, who was captured at age 7, and you might have seen the book by John Demos 25 years ago, The Unredeemed Captive. It's about Eunice Williams, who was taken captive and raised as an Indian and married a native and saw her father again, but never came back to Deerfield. And till his dying day, his hope was that he could redeem his little girl, but he never saw her again. Deerfield then went down in myth and memory as one of the most important events in New England history. Upon his release, he wrote a book called The Redeemed Captive Returned to Zion, which is one of the great sagas of early American literature. There was a genre called captivity narratives, and a few hundred of these were published in the last couple hundred years. But Reverend Williams is one of the first and one of the most important. It's really an action-adventure saga about what happened that night, and it's also a theological exposition on Puritanism and Catholicism. So it's partly obscure religious doctrine, but also action-adventure. And that book is in print to this day. It's been in print since 1707. So when Williams came back, he was celebrated as a great hero, and the Mathers celebrated him. They offered him money and a position to be a preacher in Boston, but he turned it all down, and he went back to Deerfield. And then after that, Deerfield became part of American myth and memory. The range is, for the 100th anniversary in 1804, what happened had never been called the Massacre. It had been called the mischief at Deerfield, the raid, the attack, the events of, but neither the Indians, the French, or the people who experienced it called it a massacre. It was only later, during the period of colonial revival, when people started celebrating their early American forebears, collecting antiques, collecting silver, collecting furniture. Only then, a century later, did New Englanders call it the Deerfield Massacre. So that's a more modern invention of the term. No one who survived it ever called it the Deerfield Massacre, which I find interesting. And then to the natives, it was just another event. It was not the massacre. It was just another raid on a New England town, but it became legend in Deerfield. That's partly because of historic preservation. The first effort at historic preservation in America, preceding Mount Vernon, was the effort in the 1840s to preserve what was called the Old Indian House, which had survived the fight. It was the John Sheldon House, protected by a stout, thick front oak door of 2 thicknesses of New England oak, studded with hundreds of iron nails to chip off or cause sparks to fly from flailing tomahawk blades or hatchets and axes. And the Mohawks and Hurons were never able to break down that door. They couldn't chop through it, they couldn't cut through it, they couldn't burn it down. They cut a little hole through it, through which they thrust a musket, and they killed John Sheldon's wife with a random musket blow. But they could never break that down. There was this back door to the house, and one of the occupants got afraid, escaped out the back door, and left it open. And that allowed the Indians to pour in and capture everyone in the house. But that door, with its tomahawk scars, and you can visit it today in the Pocahontas Valley Memorialization Museum. If you go to historic Deerfield, Mass., go and visit this door. And that became a character in the story. It became an iconic portal to the past. And it's one of the most important artifacts from early American history. The door really resonates and speaks to you. You're not supposed to touch the door because, and don't do it if you go there. But over the years, some of the tomahawk slices have been smoothed down from people touching. I will say this. Deerfield loves its history. I spoke there in February on the anniversary of the attack. 700 people showed up in the middle of winter to hear about the massacre. But I couldn't resist going to visit the door, as I always do. And when no one was looking, I did touch the door. But I'm careful not to touch the cuts and smooth them down. But so Deerfield really celebrates this past. And now, partly through the PVMA Museum, they welcome Native voices. Descendants of the Williams family, descendants of some of the Indian tribes come down and visit Deerfield for anniversary commemorations. And so in the past, because of the colonial revival movement, the Indians were treated as almost as a faceless mask of savages. In fact, the tombstone for Reverend Williams' wife reads, Eunice Williams, etc., felled by ye rage of ye barbarous enemy. His tombstone, from a quarter century later, reads, here lies the Reverend John Williams, the good and faithful pastor of this place. And so, over time, Deerfield began to celebrate what had happened. There were commemorations in the early 1900s, 1913, 16, 19. There were so-called Deerfield pageants, where ancestors of the people who had been in the massacre, slaughtered or survived, dressed in colonial costumes and reenacted the Bloody Brook fight, reenacted February 29, 1704, wearing colonial-style costumes. Thomas Edison's company came to Deerfield and made a movie, silent film, of the Bloody Brook Massacre and of the Deerfield Massacre of 1704. That silent film still exists. I've seen it many times. And, of course, no Indians were allowed to be acted in the film. It was white men with putty for crooked noses and red paint on their faces, which is interesting because during the Boston Tea Party, some of the white men put on red face to impersonate Indians. In this case, they impersonated Indians in the Thomas Edison film. The movie's called Ananko's Vow, and in a very brief nutshell, because I find this so interesting about how this story is carried on through hundreds of years in Deerfield. It's a central event in the history of Deerfield. The story is an Indian chief who vowed loyalty to his white friends saved a man during the Bloody Brook Massacre. 25 years later, that Indian chief's son is now chief of a tribe. His name is Ananko, and he's sworn loyalty to the Smith family, including this beautiful white maiden who's engaged to a stolid, stalwart young Puritan man. And Ananko comes to the rescue of the woman. She's about to be tortured and burned at the stake, and he comes up and says, I'm Ananko. And this is just white fantasy. I invoke the ancient right of the Indian chief. I will take the place of the white maiden. Take me and free the girl. And then ultimately, he's freed, she's freed. It all works out in the end. And then Ananko bids farewell to the white family, including Sarah Smith, the woman. And she's taken everything he has. He's given her his blanket to keep her warm. He's given her his freedom. And the whites have taken the Indian land. And Ananko tells the woman, you go east, back to Deerfield. I go west, which preconfigures the Indian Removal Acts, so the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, when the Indians were removed from New England and sent far west to Oklahoma, other places. And I like to think if the movie was made today, it would end a little differently. The young white maiden would run off with Ananko, and they'd live happily ever after. Because the Thomas Edison write-up of the film says, only for a moment did his pure heart beat of love for the girl. But, honorable man that he was, he bid her farewell. I think Hollywood would end the film today with the girl running off with Ananko and them both going west. But since that time, Deerfield has had pageants, commemorations, ceremonies. We had one this past summer. There's something called the Dublin Seminar, which studies early American history, gravestones, Native American stories, anything connected to New England. It's gone on for decades. And we had a great seminar this summer on what it all means to Native tribes, land ownership, appropriation of culture. The Deerfield Massacre certainly appropriated a lot of Native American culture. The theme of captivity, of survival, Indian trade, customs and traditions have all been appropriated into product names, sports team names, popular culture, film. John Wayne's The Searchers is a captivity narrative. He doesn't want to rescue his niece. He wants to kill her because she's gone native and become one of the Indians. And we find it in product names, from margarine names to packaging. If you look around at products and names, you realize how many of those things have been appropriated from Indian culture and from Native Americans. And so Deerfield now has a multicultural view of this whole episode, led by the PVMA, which is the first outfit in Deerfield to involve natives in telling their own story. So if you go to that museum today, you'll see a lot about the Pecumtuck Indians, the Abnaki tribes, and the multicultural story and the diverse story of this whole episode. And it's one of the great unknown early American stories from our mysterious missing past. When we think of that era of colonial America, don't we think of the Revolution, the battles of George Washington, independence from Britain? That was an early America that we can't possibly recognize. We don't know who those people were. They would be horrified at who we were. We might all be put to death for violating the customs of early America, or all be accused of witchcraft. I can't emphasize what a terrifying, frightening, mysterious, superstitious place early America was. That's the other America that existed long before the Revolution. And that's the America I try to bring alive in this book. And so I hope you all enjoy it. And I will mention one thing, because a few people asked me about this. The Manhunt book. Manhunt, as was mentioned, is now a 7-part Apple TV series made by Apple. And Tobias Menzies is going to be nominated for an Emmy Award for playing Secretary War Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton was one of the great unsung heroes from early American history. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can visit his grave at Oak Hill Cemetery. He has a beautiful obelisk. If you go to that cemetery, go to the tomb of the Carroll family, Charles Carroll. He was the clerk of the U.S. Supreme Court, and he loaned his family crypt to Abraham Lincoln so Lincoln could temporarily inter the body of his beloved son, Willie, who died at the White House in 1862. It's a wonderful historic cemetery. But Tobias does a superb job as Stanton. And Hamish Linklater is a fantastic Abraham Lincoln. I'm one of the producers of the series, and we filmed it mostly in Savannah. And I was on set and had the pleasure of watching them act out these scenes. And they're just wonderful actors. And then, has anyone seen Masters of the Air on Apple TV? The young navigator who's taken from the planes and put to a desk job, that's Anthony Boyle, who is our John Wilkes Booth. And he's great. There's a scene where I love. I think I'm looking at the real Booth. When Anthony's cornered at the barn, the Garrett farm, and Anthony says, "As God is my witness, I will never surrender." And I'm thinking, looking at the real John Wilkes Booth. And Patton Oswalt, the comedian, is a great Lafayette Baker who's hunting for Booth. And so people have asked me, as the author of the book and co-producer of the show, do you like it? Authors hate it when they see whether, but I'm thrilled that it's done. First, am I happy? Yes. For no other reason, I'm happy that Apple TV made a $130 million TV series based on a book I wrote. But the series is also great. And so it's very authentic to the spirit of the time, to the characters of the people. Hamish is Abraham Lincoln. First day I was on set, he said, "I was nervous that you were coming. You were going to see me for the first time." I said, "Hamish, I've known several Abraham Lincolns." I said, I knew Gregory Peck. I was at Gregory Peck's house when we talked about doing another project years ago. And I still remember when I walked to his house. It was a huge house, and he came in the other end of the house, and he beckoned me and said, "Mr. Swanson, welcome." And he waved his arm. I thought Captain Ahab was beckoning me to the White Whale. And Greg said, I'm not a great Abraham Lincoln. My voice is too baritone. I'm too stolid as Lincoln. It's too much to type. I'm playing too much the character. And he used to have a Lincoln library in his house, and he took it down. He said it was just too obvious. And then he saw me look sideways at a table, and he said, "Go ahead, pick him up." So I hefted in my hand Gregory Peck's 2 Academy Awards. They weighed about 12 pounds each, so they were heavy. And I've known Sam Waterston, who's a great Abraham Lincoln. I've met Hal Holbrook, who's a great Lincoln. I knew Spielberg's real Lincoln, which is Liam Neeson. He was cast as Lincoln the first time. Daniel Day-Lewis was not the first choice. It was Liam's role. And so Liam read from the script for me. He came to my house, looked at my Lincoln collection, and he did a great Lincoln accent. So I said, "Hamish, having met all these characters, today, when I saw you perform, I was looking at Abraham Lincoln. You're fantastic." He said, "Good God, I can fall asleep now knowing that I can continue in this role." But the cast was just first rate. Let me just give you one example. Lily Taylor was supposed to walk into a room and interrupt Lincoln and Stanton having a discussion, and they were going to discuss Lincoln's desire that Robert Todd Lincoln not enlist in the Union Army. Mary was worried he'd be killed. So Lily said, "I don't know. How should I walk into this room? How do I open the door? What do I do?" And the director said, "Lily, one of the experts in the world is standing right next to you. James, what should Lily do?" I said, "Mary Lincoln was an imperious woman, an impatient woman, and not a polite woman. She would open that door, not knock, walk right in and start talking and interrupt her husband and interrupt the Secretary of War." And the director said, Lily, do it that way." And that's the version that's on screen, where she walks in the room and interrupts him and starts talking. So I'm thrilled at the series. I'm thrilled it was done. I'm thrilled at its quality. So I hope you all have a chance to watch it and you enjoy it. And if anyone has a few questions, happy to hear them. Thank goodness. This is a story of death and the fate of America. I hope there's some questions.
Thank you. Can you talk about your research process, how you go about finding the primary sources you're going to base it on, how long that takes versus the writing process?
The research takes a long time. I had a head start because I was born on Lincoln's birthday. I've been collecting Lincoln books and materials since I was 10 years old. And so it's been a lifelong obsession of mine. But for other books that aren't lifelong obsessions, it takes at least 2 years to do the proper research. Either the National Archives, Library of Congress. eBay is now a great source for out-of-print publications. And so are Abe Books and other sources for that. I prefer the hard copies of things, the actual magazines, the actual newspapers. When I got interested in Lincoln, my grandmother gave me a framed engraving of Booth's Derringer pistol, framed with part of Chicago Tribune from the morning Lincoln died. And I read that story as a boy many times, and someone had taken a scissors and cut the story off in mid-sentence. And I thought, I got to know the rest of the story. When I was researching Manhunt, I was able to purchase from a rare book dealer 100 issues of the Chicago Tribune from 1865, from the time Lincoln died. And so I found the whole story that I tried to read as a boy, but more than that, I read the ads. Every ad, every woodcut, which gives a great insight into the material culture of the time. So I always prefer to look at the original photographs, the original prints, the original artifacts, the original documents. I went to Ford's Theater 100 times to get the ambiance. I went to the Peterson House dozens of times. So unless I can go to the place or hold the thing in my hands, I really can't grasp a story. So that's kind of how I do it. Anyone?
So, if you don't mind. So at the Museum of the American Indian in D.C., there's this great exhibit of cultural appropriation. It's this huge room, I'm sure some of you must have been there, of all the hundreds of things, and they're like just all these objects all over the room of things that the U.S. has appropriated for 200 years.
Yeah, it's great to see that. Until you see an exhibit like that, you don't realize how much has been done, how often it's happened. And any other questions?
Yeah, right here. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks. Do you write at all? I haven't yet had a chance to read the new book, but do you talk at all about the internal tribal politics, if it's known, rivalries amongst the tribes that participated in the raid, and between tribes and the French, and what the behavior and the politics of the French who participated in the expedition were?
I do cover that. As you know well, it's tough to recover a lot of Indian or native resources. Those were oral cultures or pictographic cultures. No Indian who ever participated in the Deerfield raid wrote a letter or a book about it.
More people added in.
We have the colonists writing about what happened, and leaders of various towns like Hatfield, Hadley, reports from New Canada, or New France as it was called, Canada, back to Europe, English writing back to Europe. And so a lot of this comes down through oral tribal histories. But I do try to get into the different motives. There are multiple French motives and multiple tribal motives. And I try to cover a lot of that in the book as much as I can. Because I had to realize the main story has to be the event itself. And my book is somewhat brief. It's about 300 pages or so. But I did as much as I could to explore that in the native perspective.
Hi, I was wondering if there's any thought, since you've had such good luck in adapting your books for middle grade and young adult readers, are you thinking about doing that with your new book?
I would love to do it as a new book, but there's a concern that it might be too violent, which I don't agree with, because I never tone down the violence. Some people ask me, are you obsessed with death and murder? Is that all you write about? No. Although when my boys were 8 and 10 years old, and they were advising me on writing the kids' version of Manhunt, they said, remember this, readers want blood and knives. But, so, and, I asked myself this question about my Martin Luther King book. And I wanted to write it out the right tone. I talked to my friend Congressman John Lewis about this, who wrote the foreword to the book. And he said, hold nothing back. Young people know if you're hiding something. Young people know if you're shielding them, protecting them. He said, just say it all. So in the King book, I described what exactly happened when King was shot. Where was Ralph Abernathy putting on Aramis cologne in the bathroom? He heard the shot. He sees Martin lying on the ground. And so I'm obsessed not with blood and death. I'm obsessed with moments of instant change in American history, when everything changes overnight, whether it's the Lincoln assassination, the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, or even the Deerfield Massacre. I'm obsessed with telling stories that have to do with moments when things change so quickly and change America. So that's my theme. I'm trying to get a kid's book going on this, but there's been some concern that it's too violent. And in these politically correct days, there's also the issue of the so-called authentic voice. My belief is any person can write about any subject if they understand it, if they sympathize, if they research it well. A black man can write a white story. A white man can write a black story. An Indian can write a Hispanic story. It all depends on the author, the sensitivity, and the expertise. So I'm not part of this movement that questions whether someone has the right to write a book. Let the book be, and let the book be judged. I think we should judge the content of a book and not the identity of the author. Anyone else? And yes, Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty.